Thanks everyone for joining the last part of the series on building great teams. So today we're going to talk about recruiting, everyone's favorite topic. So for those of you who missed the other episodes, please allow me to introduce myself briefly. So I'm very passionate about building great teams to build great products. I have over 30 years of industry experience in a variety of settings, ranging from scale-ups. I was most recently the CTO of Criteo, largest ad tech company in Europe, and of Onfido, an identity verification company. I used to work for large companies, including Google, Microsoft, HP Enterprise, and Alcatel. And I have experience with startups, both as a founder. I started two companies in the Bay Area a while back, and then also as a VP of engineering and technical advisor. So I've done a lot of hiring over the years. I must have hired over 1,500 people overall, mostly engineers, but not only. I've done a lot of hiring for product, for support, HR, finance, and pretty much at all levels, right? From individual contributors to C-level hiring. And I also ran hiring teams, talent acquisition teams at both Criteo and Onfido. I scaled high-performance engineering teams to over 600 people, right? And that's very much related to the hiring, as you'll see. These are two aspects that are very much tied together. And I'm an executive in residence at Balderton. I'm here to help you. So beyond this webinar, please feel free to reach out if you have any topics you would like to discuss. So what we'll cover today are the following. First thing is hiring that needs to be a part of your culture. Then we're going to talk about how to bootstrap and scale recruiting, setting up the recruiting pipeline and managing it, what the interview process should look like, go, no-go decisions and the offer stage. And then last but not least, improving your recruiting skills and accuracy. The first part is about hiring, which needs to be a key component of your company's culture. In fact, recruiting should be everyone's job in a company. I think it's a mistake to think that you can basically leave recruiting to the talent acquisition team. Things don't work like that. If you want to build very high quality teams, your talent acquisition team is a partner in this endeavor. But recruiting is by all means your job as well as everyone's job in the company. And so understanding this very deeply, I think, is essential. Because what does it mean, right? It means you have to be fully committed. You have to invest as much time as needed, and sometimes that's a lot, and you have to be ready to do it, knowing that this will pay off in the long run. So you should be involved with sourcing, referring, contacting, interviewing, and closing candidates as appropriate, right? And it depends how much you're going to be involved with each candidate, depending on how difficult they are to close or how senior they are. But then this applies recursively to your teams as well, right? So you need to make sure they are in the same mindset and they do this as well. And in fact, really this recruiting part should become part of the company culture. In fact, when I was at Criteo, we used to do twice a year surveys of the engineering team. And one of the things that came up repeatedly that people liked the most about the culture at Criteo was recruiting, interestingly enough. I think it's funny when I see companies use bar raisers for recruiting. I have a very different opinion on this. I think everyone in the company should be a bar raiser and basically be in a mindset of hiring people who are better than themselves. So you should only go for the best, right? You've probably seen the famous quote from Steve Jobs. There's a very good reason for this, right? Your team is your most important asset. And the team dynamics are such that if you have great people on the team, they attract other great people. And on the other hand, if you have mediocre people on a team, they not only get much less work done than probably half the number of great people would do, but they can also slow down teams quite significantly. And I've seen this over and over again. Now, there's a tension always, right? You're trying to fill your recs as quickly as possible. So you say, okay, within a month, I want to have recruited 4 engineers. And so there's always this tension of saying, well, I'm going to just hire whoever I find in that month. But I think it's a mistake. Every time I fell into that trap, I regretted it later. And today my mindset is always go for quality, even if it takes longer than you would hope, than you would expect. It's going to pay off in the long term. And keep in mind, hiring the best people is difficult even in today's environment. It's always difficult, right? It was more difficult when things were booming, but even today it's not easy, because these are not the people who are getting laid off first. It's not the people who are necessarily looking for another job. So how do you bootstrap and scale recruiting as a startup? First hires you make will set the tone. And in the beginning, you don't have a recruiting team. You may have a very small team in the company. You need to use your network to source and also potentially to help interviewing candidates. So maximize the use of your network, not only your personal network, but the network of the other folks who are already in the company. And as a founder, you need to be ready to spend significant time on recruiting. Of course, as I said, recursively, new hires who join the company should also spend significant time on recruiting. What kind of profile should you hire? Initially, temptation is hire junior people because they're cheaper and easier to find. But are you sure that's going to allow you to scale your team when you get to 50 people, 100 people? I've seen several situations where companies were struggling with scaling the teams because the teams were too junior overall. And so my recommendation would be go for mostly senior people initially, and only start hiring junior people when you know you have the capacity to mentor and grow them. You should get professional help as quickly as possible, because there's a mechanical side of recruiting where somebody can definitely help you and sort of reduce your time investment in the repetitive part of the process, right? So my experience is, there's always a question: should you get an agency, or should you find somebody who works in-house? My experience with agencies below C-level is frankly not the best. And the reason is that typically there's a clash there in terms of business model, right? You want to hire the best candidates, which means a lot of work. They want to hire as fast as possible and move on to the next assignment. So I've tried working with a number of agencies, and to be very frank, every time they got really mad at me because they thought I was being unreasonable in terms of expectations. My recommendation is C-level is another discussion, but for roles below C-level, my recommendation would be hire an in-house recruiter or get a freelancer who's basically assigned to your company. So what kind of attributes should you look for in a great recruiter? First and foremost, it's the hunter mentality, right? They really have to show passion and perseverance, right? And have this passion to actually bring people in and bring in the best people. They need to be able to articulate the problem space and the product and describe your company in a very compelling way. In fact, an interesting anecdote here is when I was at Criteo, recruiting team was seated right next to me, and I could hear them when they were taking candidates from one conference room to the other, how they were talking to candidates. And at some point, I was absolutely impressed. I said, okay, they're doing a better job than me at selling the company. So that's kind of where you're going to want to get eventually. Another important characteristic of a great recruiter is that they adapt to each candidate's personality, right? Because you see a very wide variety of personalities, and they try to sort of match that and be a good discussion partner for the candidate. They will also develop a great intuition for the quality of candidates. So when you have a great recruiter, eventually you'll get to the point where if you look at the profile and they look at the same profile, you reach the same conclusion most of the time. And last but not least, it's a volume business, as I'm going to show you. They need to operate in a data-driven mode. So how many recruiters do you need? Productivity I've seen for good recruiters is between 2 and max 4 offers a month. That's when you keep the hiring bar very high. So then, depending on how many positions you have to fill, and then what time, then you should basically use this as a rule of thumb for how many people you need. And at some point, you'll hire your first recruiting lead. Should you hire a recruiting lead first? Probably not. Hire 1 or 2 ICs and then hire a recruiting lead. But one piece of advice for that position is basically always hire a recruiting lead who's hands-on, so who's going to spend at least 50% of their time doing recruiting. Super important for the team dynamics of the recruiting team. So let's talk a little bit about the recruiting pipeline. First of all, you have to feed the pipeline. And as a small startup, you can't really expect people to just walk through your door because they have no idea who you are or that you even exist. So the main sources for finding candidates is to do sourcing and cold contacting candidates, and to rely on referrals. So these are your friends. You have to build the pipeline in a very systematic way. I'm talking about the sourcing. So decide obviously what geos you want to focus on, but also what types of companies and specific lists of companies that you want to target, which can yield the best profiles for your positions. Very important. You need to focus on diversity from the very beginning. If you get into a situation where you have 20 people in the company and they're all men, good luck hiring your first female engineer. It's going to be a really, really steep slope, and for a very good reason. So focus on diversity from day one. It will pay off, right? And do a conscious effort, right? I mean, the numbers are sort of skewed against us, right? Because the female engineer population is smaller than the male engineer population, unfortunately. But I think that's the reason why we need to make a conscious effort to build a diverse team. And then look for the right kind of experience and background. Mostly go for general skills, not narrow ones. So for instance, if you're looking for senior backend engineers, even if they don't have experience with your tech stack, they probably would take 1 or 2 months to ramp up, and that's worth the investment if you find somebody who's really good. Now, there are exceptions to this. There are roles where it takes years to ramp up, such as machine learning, security, DevOps. So there you will probably look for specific experience. What does a typical pipeline look like? So if you look at the various stages, contacted are candidates who have been cold contacted. In process are candidates who are starting the process. They have responded to the email, they have engaged, and they're ready to go. Offered and accepted are obvious. So the ratio here between contacted and offered, typically what I've seen is about 100 to 1. Now that varies in the industry. I've seen ratios from 80 to 1 to all the way up to 400 to 1. And so you might think this is crazy, but that's the way it is. Again, when you set the bar very high. And so you should be ready to deal with this and basically accept that it's a volume operation, right? And you'll need to operate this process and turn the crank. You need to track your pipeline stats. The most important ones are the funnel ratios and the funnel latency, right? You basically want to have as short a latency as possible, right? Not have a process that spreads over several weeks. Much better to have it go over maybe one day, if that's possible, or just a few days. And so you should track these stats and look at what's going on if you see significant deviation from the ratios that are shown here. Try to use an applicant tracking system as early on as possible. Lever is one example. There are several others you can use. None of them is perfect, but it probably doesn't matter. And keep in mind that referrals are a very, very powerful way to reduce these ratios significantly. So what I've shown you here in terms of ratios are for cold contacted candidates. Referrals work much better in terms of conversion. So you should probably target about 20–30% of your hires from referrals. Put in place a referral bonus early on, right, for people who are hired following a referral. That's going to be super helpful. So how do you tune your pipeline? Number of contacted people, really, this is a matter of sourcing volumes. And you can have the recruiter source, but as I mentioned, you should do that yourself as well, and you should ask your teams to do that as well. And don't forget, again, diversity sourcing. What I used to do, for instance, was to ask teams to do diversity sourcing every other week. So they would spend 2 hours for a sourcing session, and they would only source diverse candidates during that time. Awesome way to help build the pipeline and to help increase diversity. In process, so how do you convert from contacted to in process? Depends on what kind of message you send the candidates, right? Is it punchy? And also who sends the message, right? And typically it should be one of the founders, even if behind the scenes it's not the founder sending the message. Maybe it's somebody using their LinkedIn account, but it should come, in a small startup, it should come from one of the founders. And so you need to hone your pitch and also make sure that recruiters master it. And then offered basically depends on the quality of the sourcing and basically also the interview process, right? I mean, if you see that you have a poor offered ratio, you should look at these two things. Either you're not looking for the right profiles, or you have some kind of noise in your interview process and you're not selecting the right candidates. And then accepted basically depends on how well you can sell the company, what kind of package you offer them, and frankly, perseverance, right? I mean, when I was at Criteo and on Fido and during my previous jobs as well, I was always ready to jump in and help close candidates, irrespective of the level, right? I mean, I've done it for ICs, I've done it for mid-level, I've done it for very senior candidates, obviously. So you should always be ready to spend that time and help close the candidates. Sometimes, you know, if a candidate is sort of haven't made up their mind yet, if they talk to the founder, that might be super helpful. Let's talk a little bit about the interview process. So the most important thing about the interview process is keeping in mind that this is something which is not about checking boxes, but about measuring depth, right? You want to probe specific areas and understand how much depth do the candidates have. So you need to formalize the interview process. There's nothing worse than not being properly prepared and knowing exactly what you want to probe during this process. Typically, what you would have is a phone screen and 4 additional interview steps. Now, I would say avoid more than 4 because that's too many. And my personal preference is also to avoid the homework assignments, especially for senior candidates for a variety of reasons. I think it's more useful to interact with them directly. And so you need to be crystal clear about what gets covered in each step. And steps could be 2 coding interviews, a design interview, systems design interview, and a culture fit and motivation interview. Start building an internal recruiting guild as early as possible. And basically what this guild needs to do is standardize the interview questions, document them, and document good answers and drill down questions. Again, remember the reason for this process is to measure depth. And so you need to have all the drill down questions so that you can go from the basic question that you ask initially into details and related areas. And you should keep this information up to date on your internal wiki. Also, make sure interviewers are calibrated. We're not going to have time to go into that today, but that's very important, right? So that basically, no matter who interviews the candidate, it's likely they will basically make the same decision. And then there's a question of how should you balance probing for skills versus selling the candidate on the opportunity. And I think early on in the process, you should mainly focus on probing. And then depending on the seniority of the candidate, their mindset, you should do more and more selling in the later stages of the interview process. So you need to evaluate specific skills. So the right approach here is to ask competency-based questions, which means the types of questions that can only be answered by somebody who has that particular skill. So examples would include, ask them to write some code, solve a specific problem, design a specific system, debug an issue. You can also ask questions such as describe a situation where you had to take immediate action because the service was down, and then you drill down into that. The wrong approach is to make any kind of assumptions, right? So you could assume that they have the skill because it's listed on their profile. They may not have it. You can assume they have the skill because they claim to have the skill. You can assume they have it based on their education and experience, and you'd be surprised. So anti-patterns for questions are things like describe your current project. That's very soft and you don't learn very much. Or have you used React Native? And the answer could be yes. Okay. So remember, never assume anything that you haven't probed, right? Trust but verify. I think it was one of the American presidents who coined that. But anyway, I think it's quite appropriate here. So I mentioned having an interview plan. This is an example of what an interview plan could look like for a software developer generalist. And basically you should say, what are the stages, what is being assessed during each stage, right? And make sure that the interviewers actually understand this quite well. And then interviewers should have, depending on the stage they're doing, they should have an interviewer checklist. So they should obviously be very familiar with the candidate's profile. And I recommend asking one question related to an item in the profile and drilling down on that. And they should clearly know what they need to assess during the interview. Make sure they have backup questions handy because sometimes, in fact, I see candidates, the vast majority of candidates being very honest, right? You may ask them a coding question and they would tell you, hey, I just interviewed with somebody else and that's the question they asked me. And so they will be very frank about this, right? So be prepared to have a backup question if you get into that situation. And also interviewers should understand if any concerns and what concerns were raised during previous interviews and double check if necessary. You also need to assess cultural fit, cultural add, and candidate motivation, right? In addition to the technical skills. So these are things that should be assessed sort of in the background by all the interviewers. And good questions to ask oneself as an interviewer is, do I want to work? Would I be excited to work with this candidate? Would they fit in well with our company culture? Or would they actually enhance our company culture if we bring them on board? Motivation primarily assessed during the final interview. So what do you ask to assess motivation? A typical question I ask is, let's say you join a new company, irrespective of which company, and after 1 or 2 years, you want to assess from your personal point of view whether this was a success for you or not. You could also ask the question as, what makes you happy? And then listen carefully to the answers. There's no single right answer, right? I mean, people have different motivations, but make sure their motivations are aligned with your company. So if they tell you, hey, I want to change the world, I want to build great products for our customers, I want to help grow the business. I mean, these are things that should resonate with a startup, right? What I typically ask more junior people is, describe your ideal role, right? If you could choose what to spend time on, whether it's architecture, coding, debugging, or fixing incidents in production, what would you do, right? And if they tell you, well, I want to spend most of my time on architecture, then maybe that's not the best person for you in a startup. And then gauge the level of energy and passion, but be careful, right? Because it depends on the candidate's personality and on cultural differences. So some candidates may express this less than others, right? So you should be aware of that. There's a couple of do's and don'ts in the interview process. So first of all, you need to be in control of the conversation. So first of all, you need to manage the time very carefully during the interview, right? I mean, sometimes the candidates may go on a long rant, and unless you manage the time, you're not going to be able to probe everything you wanted, right? So in those cases, you need to steer the discussion, being very polite, but firm, right? And you need to bring them back to the set of topics that you wanted to discuss. Now, there are a number of things that you should never discuss during the interview. So definitely any kind of sensitive topics, personal status, political or religious belief, sexual orientation, not relevant at all. And so even if the candidate volunteers information about this, you should very politely steer the discussion back to a professional setting and what you actually want to talk about with the candidate. And then salary expectations, don't have random discussions at any stage of the interview process on salary expectations. Typically, this is something that the recruiter can handle, and also that can be discussed at the final stage. Another do is to be prepared to handle difficult situations because they will come up invariably. So things that I've seen in the past, and it's a subset, candidate doesn't talk very much, so you have to pull information out of them. Or they talk too much, right, as I mentioned already. Or they're visibly intimidated, and that's not a good thing because they may interview very poorly, but they may be an awesome hire, right? So you need to basically allow them to show you their best, basically. They talk about topics you're not familiar with, so you can't say whether they're saying something interesting or not. They become aggressive, or as I mentioned, they start volunteering personal details. And then there are a number of things that you should absolutely avoid, like trying to prove you're smart, or not listening to the candidate, or dwelling on their failures, right? Obviously, you should not be smug or impolite during the interview, because remember, this is a two-way process, right? So you need to provide an excellent candidate experience. You need to remember you're interviewing the candidate, but they're also interviewing you and your company, right? And in fact, if you look at startups, really, I would say that candidate branding is pretty much the same as candidate experience, right? You don't really have a brand. And so what the candidate sees during the interview process is basically the presentation of your company. Keep that in mind, right? And put your best foot forward when you talk to candidates. Before the interview, you should let candidates know what to expect and how the interview loop is structured, right? So this should not be a surprise to them. And make sure the recruiters can answer any questions the candidates may have about this. During the interview, you need to adapt to the level of seniority of the candidate, listen to them, be open and friendly. And very importantly, give candidates something to take away from the interview, even if you don't end up hiring them. In fact, we were polling candidates whom we declined at my last couple of companies. And it's interesting, a number of positive comments from these candidates were, look, I understand I didn't get the position, but actually I learned something during this interview, or it was interesting to interact with these people, right? I think that's very important because basically they're going to talk to their friends, right? And even somebody whom you've declined may refer someone whom you're going to end up hiring. So run candidate surveys, both hired and rejected candidates understand how they basically found the experience and try to improve it based on that. And then if a candidate declines your offer, make sure you keep in touch with them because who knows, you may be able to hire them in 6 months or a year, right? So make sure you use your applicant tracking system to basically periodically ping these candidates. So how do you make a decision, and then how do you offer candidates? What I've done pretty much at all companies was to use a scoring system, and you can use a score from 1 to 5, let's say, with one decimal digit. And then you need to define very clearly what the scores mean, right? You see an example here, but then you may have your own definitions. And what the criteria are based on these scores, right? So in this system here, if there's one single score that's 2.0 or below, then that means stop the process, right? Don't waste your time, don't waste the candidate's time, thank them politely, and that's basically it. Now, having a scoring system relies on the fact that the interviewers are reasonably well calibrated, because otherwise the scores don't mean anything. And related to that, it's very important to also ask them to take as detailed as possible interview notes that you're going to store normally in your applicant tracking system. It's important to store these because the hiring manager will probably want to review these notes. And also, on occasion, give feedback to the interviewers based on the notes, right? You could have asked this other question, which would have been a more interesting drill down or stuff like that, right? So make sure this is something that people do without having to be pushed, right? And that they enter the notes as quickly as possible after the interview so that they're available. So let's say you have a candidate whom you've decided to offer. The turnaround time is very important here because really it shows to the candidate how much you love them, right? You should aim for 24 hours and try not to go over 48 hours. I think a mistake people make occasionally is to say, oh, we're going to interview these 5 candidates over 3 weeks. And then we're going to pick the best and make them an offer. And I think that's a mistake because you're probably going to lose the best. So basically have your bar very high. If you like the candidates, don't wait for anything else. Make them an offer right then and there. Also, make the offers always conditional on checking references because checking references takes a while and it's something you absolutely have to do. I've had a number of occasions when I didn't check references or didn't do it properly, and I came to regret that. You need to understand package expectations and market rates. So how do you find out about market rates? Well, you use your experience, you ask your connections, and why not, you can use a benchmarking company that will basically provide you the rates for specific geos and for specific profiles. Be very careful. I would not offer lower than the market. It's going to come back to haunt you later. In fact, this happened at one of my previous companies. And so when we finally got around to do a market study and understand where everyone should be in terms of salaries, we realized some people, and these were some of the best people in the tech team, were at 50% market rate. Now, you have a ticking time bomb, needless to say. If you do that, it's going to be very painful to fix as well, right? I mean, the year we did that, these people got around 60% salary increase. That's the kind of heroics you have to do. Better avoid it altogether. And then I mentioned this, I'm going to repeat it here. Spend as much time selling the company and the opportunity, and accommodate any request the candidate may have to further discuss with the founders or the team they're going to be working with. So how do you improve your recruiting skills? Well, first of all, this is not an exact science, and we all make hiring mistakes. And I've had my fair share of those. Here are three that I made, but there's more than that. I hired a software developer who turned out not to be able to write a single line of code, a database expert who could not design even a simple schema, and an ops person who this was self-hosted environment. We filled the data center cage with garbage. So try to not make too many mistakes, but more importantly, try to learn from the mistakes you've made, right? So you should check on hires and see how they're doing after 3, 6, 9 months. And then when you realize you've made a mistake, ask yourself, what could you have done differently during the interview process so that you would not have decided to offer that candidate. Very important. I see this in some companies, and I think it's a terrible idea. Do not use probation periods to correct for frequent mistakes. You need to fix the mistakes instead. If you use a probation period for that, it basically becomes a revolving door, and it creates a very bad culture. Essentially, existing employees, when they see somebody new joining, they will go, well, what are the chances that this person is still going to be on board in 3 months from now? So maybe we're not going to spend that much time helping them ramp up, right? Because they're probably not going to be here anymore. So avoid that, because every time I've seen this, it resulted in a sort of disaster. So to summarize, your team is your key asset, right? And your company's success critically depends on the team that you build. So that's why you should spend significant time on recruiting, both you and your team. And you should make hiring a key part of your culture. Make sure you have a great recruiting process in place, and keep in mind the candidate experience. That's your storefront for the candidates. And you should strive at getting better at hiring over time. So I'm going to end this presentation with a remark. You should always be super proud of the great hires that you've made. And you should remember that the best hires you can make are people who are better than you. And if you can make these types of hires, then you'll probably have a phenomenal team in place.